The winter of 1940 to c. 1943 remains etched in naval history as the nadir of the Allied war effort at sea. For nearly 3 years, the Battle of the Atlantic had raged across a merciless ocean battlefield stretching from the Arctic Circle to the Caribbean. Admiral Carl Dnitz's Kriegsmarine, wielding hundreds of Type VII and Type IX U-boats, had transformed the North Atlantic into a graveyard of steel, organized into wolf packs, coordinated groups of submarines guided by precise radio intelligence. They struck with surgical precision, sinking merchant vessels at a rate that outpaced the combined output of British, Canadian, and American shipyards by March 1943. The monthly losses exceeded 700,000 tons of shipping. Britain's food reserves dwindled 2 weeks. Fuel rationing crippled industry, and the promised flow of American Lend-Lease aid threatened to dry up entirely. Winston Churchill later confessed that the U-boat peril was the only thing that ever truly frightened him during the war. Sailors on convoy duty spoke in hushed tones of the second happy time for the Germans, when U-boats seemed to materialize from nowhere, their commanders possessing an almost clairvoyant ability to predict convoy routes. That ability rested on a sophisticated system of high-frequency direction-finding HFDF, or Huffduff to the Allies, but far more refined in German hands. Shore-based stations along the occupied European coast and aboard the U-boats themselves listened ceaselessly for Allied radio transmissions, routine weather reports, position checks, escort coordination, even the briefest administrative chatter, because Allied radio procedures followed strict, predictable standards. German operators could triangulate bearings with remarkable accuracy, often fixing a convoy's position within a few miles across thousands of square miles of empty sea. Once located, wolf packs converged, attacked under cover of darkness or storm, and vanished before air or surface escorts could respond effectively. It was against this backdrop of despair that a seemingly insignificant incident occurred aboard HMS Firebrand, a Flower-class corvette escorting the slow convoy SC-120 through the howling mid-Atlantic in late February 1943. The radio operator responsible for the midnight to dawn watch was Petty Officer Jack Harlan, 22 years old, slight of build, with ink-stained fingers and a perpetual squint from hours spent hunched over dials in dim red light. Harlan had grown up on a farm near Peoria, Illinois, where the only electricity came from a wind charger that powered a single bulb and a battered Atwater Kent radio. He could coax music from static when neighbors heard only noise. The Navy recognized his gift and trained him as a spark transmitter, but the rigid protocols of wartime communication chafed against his intuitive feel for electromagnetic waves during a particularly vicious gale that snapped halyards and flooded the mess decks. The corvette's primary long-range HF antenna, a vertical wire stretched between foremast and a jury-rigged aft insulator, was shredded by wind and ice, with the convoy under strict radio silence except for essential signals. Harlan was ordered to restore long-range capability using the spare wire coiled in the radio shack. Exhausted after 3 consecutive watches and soaked to the skin, Harlan worked by flashlight in the pitching darkness. In his fatigue, he committed what would later be recorded in the ship's log as a serious procedural violation. INS. TEAD of rigging the replacement wire in the standard vertical dipole configuration. Insulated ends high, feed line centered. He inverted the entire setup. The wire sloped downward from the masthead to a low point near the waterline on the port quarter, reversing polarity and creating an asymmetrical, skewed radiator that no textbook would ever sanction. When the set was tested at low power the next morning, the results were alarming. Outgoing signals arrived at nearby escorts distorted and warbled, bearing anomalous side lobes and sporadic bursts of static. Incoming signals suffered reciprocal interference. The communications officer, Lieutenant Reginald Carver, a by-the-book veteran of Jutland in the previous war, exploded in rage. "This abomination will broadcast our position like a bloody lighthouse," he thundered. Harlan was confined to quarters pending disciplinary action, and urgent signals were sent to the senior escort requesting permission to break formation briefly, in order to dismantle the hazardous installation. Yet the North Atlantic rarely grants respite. Before the corvette could heave to for repairs, the convoy entered a prolonged spell of heavy weather that made working aloft suicidal. The inverted antenna remained in place by default, used only when absolutely necessary and at minimal power. Then the anomalies began. First it came from the destroyer HMS Vedette, leading the escort screen. Her captain logged an unusual absence of distant hydrophone effect, the faint screw noises that usually betrayed approaching U-boats. Lookouts reported no periscopes or conning towers where intelligence had predicted wolf pack assembly. When the convoy altered course at dusk, a standard zigzag to throw off pursuers, no shadowing U-boat risked a sighting report that would normally summon the pack days later. Fragments of intercepted Enigma traffic reached the convoy commodore via secure shore relay. German messages spoke of confusion. Convoy signals detected bearing 270 degrees. Strength 4. But subsequent bearings fluctuate wildly, another U-boat commander complained. Target appears to change course without alteration of speed impossible, a third reported expending for torpedoes on an acoustic contact that proved to be open ocean aboard Firebrand. Harlan, released from confinement to resume duties, quietly noted that whenever they transmitted on the inverted antenna, German shadowing seemed to falter. He kept his observations to himself at first, fearing further reprimand, but the pattern repeated across multiple legs of the voyage. Convoys that had previously lost 10 or 15 ships limped into Liverpool with only minor straggler losses. Word spread through back channels. Other radio operators, forced by storm damage to improvise similar non-standard rigs, reported identical experiences. A Canadian corvette in HX 227 claimed no attacks at all during a crossing, previously considered suicidal. A destroyer escort in on 166 logged U-boat captains breaking off contact in apparent frustration. By April 1943, the statistical divergence could no longer be ignored. Analysts at the Western Approaches Command in Liverpool plotted loss rates against radio logs and discovered a striking correlation. Ships and escorts employing skewed, inverted, or otherwise irregular HF antennas suffered dramatically lower attrition. The effect was most pronounced in the mid-Atlantic air gap, where U-boats depended almost entirely on radio direction finding. A highly classified investigation code-named Operation Erratic was launched under the direction of Commander Roger Wynne, head of the Admiralty as Submarine Tracking Room, and a team of radio physicists from the Naval Research Laboratory. Working in secrecy, they recreated Harlan-esque configuration in controlled tests off the Scottish coast. The results stunned them. The inverted wire did not merely distort signals, it exploited a fundamental limitation in German HFTF gear. The enemy's Spielgert systems were optimized for symmetrical, predictable radiation patterns. When fed the chaotic, multi-lobed propagation from a skewed antenna, their cross-bearing plots scattered across hundreds of miles. Ghost signals appeared and vanished. False course changes registered, and the true bearing often lay hidden among a dozen phantoms. The U-boats, trained to trust their instruments implicitly, chased mirages while the real convoys steamed onward and detected the implications were revolutionary. For years, Allied commanders had sought technological silver bullets, better radar, longer-range aircraft, hedgehog mortars, while the simplest countermeasure had emerged by accident. Deliberate imperfection. The reversal came swiftly, but silently. The ban on non-standard antenna configurations was lifted overnight. New classified appendices to signal manuals instructed radio officers to introduce controlled symmetries, sloping wires, off-center feeds, even periodic power fluctuations sufficient to confuse enemy DF without crippling Allied reception. Operators were drilled in erratic transmission discipline, a phrase that would have been heresy months earlier. Jack Harlan, recalled to Derby House in Liverpool, demonstrated his setup to a room of bemused admirals and scientists. He received no public accolades. Security demanded anonymity, but a quiet promotion to chief petty officer and assignment to the training cadre followed. In the following months, the new doctrine spread across the Atlantic Fleet. The payoff was immediate and profound. May 1943 once forecast as the month Britain might starve saw U-boat kills drop precipitously. Wolf packs dispersed in confusion. Fuel and torpedoes wasted on empty ocean. DNITZ, sensing a profound shift he could not explain, ordered reduced radio traffic, which in turn blinded his own coordination. By summer, escorted convoys crossed with near impunity, and the initiative passed irrevocably to the Allies. Historians still debate the precise contribution of erratic transmission amid the many factors: Centime Tri-Sea radar, airborne escort carriers, liberated Enigma keys that finally broke the U-boat arm. Yet declassified records reveal that in the critical spring of 1943, convoys employing the new radio countermeasures suffered loss rates 75–85%, 85%, lower than those adhering to traditional procedures. Thousands of merchant sailors who might have perished reached port. Millions of tons of cargo, Sherman tanks, aviation spirit, canned spam, locomotives and crates poured into Britain, sustaining the island fortress and enabling the build-up for Overlord. Jack Harlan returned home in 1946, opened a small radio repair shop in Peoria, and rarely spoke of the war. When pressed by old shipmates decades later, he would shrug and say, "I just put the wire up backwards because I was bone-tired." Turns out the ocean didn't care about the rulebook in the end. One man's exhausted mistake, condemned as dangerous, nearly erased by protocol, became an invisible shield stretched across an ocean. It reminded a generation locked in technological arms race that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not superior machinery, but the enemy's overconfidence in his own. The U-boats never fully understood what hit them. They simply found, to their fury and bewilderment, that the convoys had learned to vanish into thin air, guided by nothing more exotic than a bent piece of wire and the stubborn unpredictability of the human hand.